Hi, I am Sabina Simonson, Outreach Services and Volunteer Coordinator for the Talbot County Free Library, and you are watching the Talbot County Free Library presents Underground Railroad Journeys, Finding Douglass and Tubman on the Eastern Shore by Jim Duffy. Jim is the co-founder with his wife, the photographer Jill Chasuta, of Secrets of the Eastern Shore, a local business that celebrates the heritage and beauty of the Delmarva Peninsula in words, pictures, and products. Jim is an award-winning magazine writer whose work has appeared in numerous regional publications. He is also the author of Eastern Shore Road Trips, 27 one-day adventures on Delmarva. Please welcome Jim Duffy.
Thanks for coming. I appreciate it. I would like to start out by jumping right in and telling you a love story. All right? This story always comes to mind when I am on Route 50, coming down from the bridge. I live in Cambridge. On my way to Easton, I get past Skipton, and I come to Rabbit Hill Road. Now, we don't know exactly where this happened, but for some reason in my mind's eye, this is where I see it. There is a little boy, 6-ish years old, and there is a woman in her 50s. And they're walking through the farm fields. And the farm fields, you know, there might have been different products or whatever, but there were farm fields there in the 1820s, just like there are today. And they're walking through the fields. They've been walking for a long time, and the boy is tired. And that woman picks that boy up and throws him over her shoulder like a sack of wheat, and they keep walking. That boy was Fred Bailey, who grew up to become Frederick Douglass. Douglass's life on the Eastern Shore, as we'll see in the next 30, 40 minutes, was a roller coaster. Up and down, emotionally, hitting emotional highs and emotional lows that are very relatable to us when we think about them, but are probably a little more extreme than what we've been through in our life. And you would think that being born up on Tuckahoe Creek near Denton, into slavery, into a one-room cabin, not seeing your mother very often, she seems to have always been working off on other farms, not knowing who your father is, not having met brothers and sisters at a young age, you would think that would be starting at the bottom of the roller coaster. But actually, in Douglass's memory later in life, he kind of thought of it as starting at the top of the roller coaster. He has a very funny few paragraphs about being a little boy and not having to worry about soiling your fancy clothes because you don't have any fancy clothes, and not having to worry about reading pretty verse to your aunts and uncles to show them how smart you are because nobody cares and nobody's going to teach you how to read. And he ends that section by saying, and think about the landscape up there along the creek with the woods and the streams and everything else. He literally runs wild. He is, for the most part of the first 8 years of his life, a spirited, joyous, uproarious, and happy boy. That period in Fred Bailey's life ended on that long walk. His grandmother, who was his primary caretaker, told him one day that they were going on an adventure, and they packed up and they walked, I think it's 12, 14 miles. They were going to the Lobe plantation, and that is where Douglass's owner, a guy named Aaron Anthony, worked. And that is where, when the children of his slaves got to a certain age and are able to do some menial tasks, that's where he sent them to go. And so that's where they walk. This place is like nothing little Fred Bailey has ever seen before. Slavery on the Eastern Shore was predominantly a very small farm situation. This place was someplace straight out of Gone with the Wind, with 200 slaves and shipbuilding and blacksmith operations, an entire small city. Ironically, considering all the things that Douglass would go through in his life, his problem at the Lobe plantation was not really with the violence or the unfairness of slavery. It was with a member of his own family. his Aunt Katie. She was in charge of the kitchen where slave children got their food. And she either took an intense dislike to this little boy, or she decided that he needed an extreme dose of tough love. And she did not give him enough food. And when she did deign to give him food, she did not protect him from older slave boys who would then steal his food. And this situation actually got pretty bad. It went on for months and months. And Douglass remembers fighting off dogs for scraps of meat and foraging in creeks for raw shellfish because he was hungry all of the time. And then one day, one winter day, kind of out of the blue, his mother, who I mentioned that he barely knew, showed up to say hello to him. And what she did when this little boy poured out all of his complaints to her was fix everything in the blink of an eye. She read the riot act to Aunt Katie, brought in whatever kind of authorities on the plantation needed to be brought in to make sure that her little boy never had to go through what he had been going through ever again. And Douglass remembers, that night I learned I was not only a child, but somebody's child. I felt prouder on my mother's knee than a king upon his throne. If you flash forward 25, 30 years, little Fred Bailey is an adult. He has escaped slavery. He is on his way to earning his place in the history books as an orator and a writer and an abolitionist. He's living in a very different society, and one small example of that difference is people are celebrating birthdays. He has no idea when his birthday is. He actually didn't even know the year. It was historians who figured out that it was 1818 after much later on. But he wanted to celebrate his birthday every year. And so he chose February 14th, which is why we celebrated that bicentennial back on Valentine's Day. He purposely chose February 14th, and the reason why he chose February 14th is he remembered his mother serving him a piece of ginger cake cut into the shape of a heart, and he remembered her calling her my little Valentine on that night when she fixed everything. The stories about the Underground Railroad, because they involve slavery, are obviously about America at her worst. They are also, in some ways, about America at her best. I do not know by what sort of magic the lowest of the low, an enforced low, of people in slavery somehow got imbued with the values that the country was kind of founded on and that we celebrate today, but it happened. Take, for example, channeling Horatio Alger. What better up from your bootstraps story is there than Frederick Douglass? This is a guy who learned the basic letters of the alphabet as a child from a white woman who was then stopped from continuing to teach him to read, and all he knew was the letters of the alphabet. And he somehow, on his own, with no schooling, turned that into a literacy and becoming a great writer. He talks about tricks when he's up in Baltimore for a while as a kid. He asked, like white kids, what was the name of that boat going by? And he would see the name on the back of the boat, and then they would tell him what the name was, and he would scratch the letters in the dirt, and he would match up the letters with the sounds in order to teach himself how to read. And this boy, between the ages of 8-ish and 12-ish, became highly literate and is reading books of Columbian orators with classic Greek and Roman oratory, and then of course went on to write these spectacular books that leave a guy like me nowadays who earns his living as a writer in awe, basically, of his writing skills. Also, on the Underground Railroad, they are kind of channeling Patrick Henry. There's a famous quote from Harriet Tubman that goes, "There are two things I've got a right to, and these are death or liberty, one or the other I mean to have." They're channeling too, a sort of one nation under God, because faith plays an incredible role in these stories. Douglass in many ways, but particularly Harriet Tubman. I'll tell you a story about that in a moment. The worst of times, also the best of times, and the best of times because, the best of America, I should say, also because these are people who are doing glorious things in inglorious times. There we go. I want to give you a couple of postscripts to that love story that I started out with. In that same period, when Douglass felt like a king upon the throne on his mother's lap, was the first time that he learned that there was a place where slavery did not exist. He learned that through the family grapevine because his Aunt Jenny and Uncle Noah escaped from slavery, and the word spread through the Bailey clan that this had happened. One thing that comes up over and over again that was heartbreaking to me in doing my work on this book is how hard it was for people to leave slavery. Sometimes when you see a historic marker out there and it says, you know, so-and-so was enslaved here, so-and-so had a rough go of it, so-and-so escaped. It makes it sound like an easy decision. Aunt Jenny and Uncle Noah left their kids behind when they ran away. And that's something that comes up again and again, leaving parents behind, leaving siblings behind, leaving lovers behind, in order to make a run for freedom. If we flash forward even farther than the 30 or so years I started with and go to 1878, we all know that the reason why Douglass's statue is on the courthouse is because he gave a speech there. That speech was kind of a self-help speech. It was kind of something like Tony Robbins would do nowadays. It was about getting yourself educated and saving money and just getting your life in order and looking forward and having big dreams. It's an interesting speech, but what really interests me is what else he did while he was here. He hired a carriage to take him back to Tuckahoe Creek, where he spent those first 6 years of his life. And when he got there, and we've all seen the pictures of the shock of white hair and the very formal suit. There's all these rumors that he's running for Senate and reporters are following him everywhere he goes and all that. And the farm where his owner lived is gone by this point. The cabin where his grandmother raised him is gone by this point. He's got to go tromping through the woods in search of an old cedar tree to figure out if he's got the right spot where he was born and grew up. And when he finally finds it and he's satisfied that he has found it, he gets down on his hands and knees and he digs up a bunch of dirt and he puts it in, I don't know what, a handkerchief or a little box or something, and then he brings it back to his nice home in Washington, D.C., and he puts it on display there. And I don't want to make too much of it because it might not be that much different from the way we buy a postcard to remember some place that didn't happen to be any place selling postcards, so he decided to bring some dirt home. But to me, seeing that guy in his suit down on his knees digging up that dirt is kind of like a rosebud moment. And the way he talked about the first 6 years of his life, if you all are familiar with Citizen Kane and how that went. I think that I had, one of the false impressions I had before I started working on this was that somehow white families here on the Eastern Shore were established, had been here for a long time, and somehow the black people were newcomers and from a foreign shore, first generation immigrant. Dixon Preston, the historian in his book, Young Frederick Douglass, traces back Fred Bailey's lineage and traces back the lineage of the Lloyd family, and they both went back 5 generations on the Eastern Shore. Harriet Tubman was, of course, a 3rd generation. Her grandmother was the one who came over. And you might be familiar, there was a movement back then called the colonization movement that some of it was good-hearted, some of it was evil-minded, and it was folks who thought that blacks would never be able to be a functioning part America and this society, and what we should do is ship them off and give them their own country somewhere else. Harriet Tubman was very opposed to that. She famously said, "We're rooted here and they can't dig us up." And it's this sort of context that I like to think. I like to think of elderly Frederick Douglass on his knees digging up dirt when you get to that famous quote that is sometimes thrown around in offhand fashion, but I don't think it should. I think it's a very genuine quote, despite the horrors and trials that he went through in slavery. And that quote, of course, is, "I am an Eastern Shoreman with all that name implies. Eastern Shore corn and Eastern Shore pork gave me my muscle. I love Maryland and the Eastern Shore." This notion that I started out with about looking through the mind's eye when I get to Rabbit Hill Road and see that 50-year-old woman and that 6-year-old boy. There's other spots where I could do that. There's a place down near the Harriet Tubman Museum outside of Cambridge when you're going over the Little Blackwater River, and there's a tributary off to the right called Button's Creek. There was a woman named Jane Kane who was enslaved by a really horrible man named Horatio Jones there. She was in love with Ben Ross, who was Harriet Tubman's brother. Without going into the Christmas escape in any detail, it covers, there's three different chapters about it in the book. I break it into 3 different parts. When Tubman was coming for her brothers who were about to be sold, Ben somehow slipped a package into the garden at Horatio Jones's place, and that contained a suit of men's clothes that Jane Kane then put on and walked through the property in disguise, presumably with a hat looking like this 18-year-old girl looking like an 18-year-old boy, and no one recognized her leaving. So I always see kind of that too. And this is one of, when I go see people like me talk, I hear a lot of doom and gloom about ways of life that are disappearing, about development that is coming in, about different kinds of people that are coming in, and things disappearing. I'm more optimistic than most of the people who are up at stages like this, and I'm more optimistic because of my work on this Underground Railroad book, where I see that these stories are still there. Along the Underground Railroad, there's very few places, I'm going to tell you about one in a second, but there's very few places where you can genuinely feel like you're walking in the footsteps of Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, and other runaways. But those stories are out there, and if we can just learn to look at them in kind of a new, fresh way by seeing them unfold on a landscape instead of at a place like Monticello or ruins like Furnace Town, which is the way that we're used to seeing them. They're still there. There's a book, Charles Mann wrote this book, 1491, and it's all about how what America was like before Columbus came, and he talks in there, and I've heard people come and talk about how they get interested in history by going over to Europe and seeing the Parthenon or the Colosseum and being completely stunned by the amount of history that they have over there. And his point is that we have all that history here. There's incredible stories all over both continents in the Native American world. What we generally don't have are buildings and artifacts. And we have to learn to see those stories and to feel those stories without having that sort of tactile experience of going someplace. And that's why I really want to give credit to everybody who has worked so hard on both the Tubman stories and the Douglass stories and the Underground Railroad Byway and the new museum, because they're really making a great effort to push people out and see how these stories are still here on this landscape, even if there's not a particular building that you can go see. The Bucktown Village store. Has anybody been to the Bucktown Village store? Yeah. That's one place where you can feel like you're walking in Harriet Tubman's footsteps, right? It's a little country store. It's near where the Tubman Museum is, a couple miles away. It may not be the precise same building that was there when Tubman was a young woman, but it's simply the same building built on the same foundation with new wood. The foundation is the same. That's what most historians have come to think of it as. It's either that building or it's a new building on exactly the same footprint built in like the 1860s. When she was there in the 1840s, it might have been a different building. So she was born, her name was Araminta Ross, and she was born over in this place called Harrisville Road. Douglass, I mentioned, had no sort of, very few family connections. He had his grandmother. He didn't even know his brothers and sisters existed until he got to, well, he had heard rumors of his brothers and sisters, and then he got to the Lloyd plantation and he actually met them for the first time. And also, in another sad footnote to that first love story, after that night on his mother's knee, he never saw her again. So his family situation was broken from the beginning. Araminta Ross, Harriet Tubman, was born into a family situation that was completely intact. Her father was owned by a guy who did not own her mother, but was in charge of the estate that owned her mother until another guy became 21 years old. And all of her sisters were in place when she was young. She was one of the younger ones in the family. But after that guy turned 21 years old, that family started to fall apart. 3 sisters were sold south. The kids and the mother were pulled away from the father. So it's kind of the opposite story of starting in an intact family. And the writer Jean Humez speculates, it's a great speculation, that for what really drove Tubman for the rest of her life was that she was the Humpty Dumpty child trying to put her family back together again after going through the heartbreak of it falling apart. So this is when the young 21-year-old guy pulls the mother and children away. They're living in this Bucktown, and Harriet has to go to the store. She's 12-ish, 13-ish. I'm not familiar with what it's like to work on flax, but apparently it's really filthy, dirty work. She was embarrassed about the way her hair looked after working on flax, and so she wrapped herself in some sort of a towel or scarf. While she's in the store, an overseer is chasing a young enslaved boy, and he orders Harriet Tubman to stop that boy, and she refuses, and this is, everybody recognizes at least her first known act of defiance against slavery. That overseer then picked up a metal weight of the kind they used to have in hardware stores and flung it at the boy and hit Harriet in the head instead, and very nearly killed her. She always said, "That there scarf saved my life." She was recovering for a period of more than a year. The writer Kate Clifford Larson has done some really great detective work and linked this incident. These kinds of head injuries are often associated with something called temporal lobe epilepsy. And the symptoms of temporal lobe epilepsy include hearing voices, seeing visions, and having narcoleptic sleeping episodes, all of which Tubman had throughout the rest of her life. Those voices and those visions, and even the thoughts that she would have when she came out of her sleeping sickness and woke up, she took those to be the voice of God in her life. She is rightly celebrated for being ingenious when it came to telling little white lies when she needed to, or getting in disguises, or running little moments of subterfuge, but there were also moments when she had no tricks up her sleeve. One of those moments was when her parents got in trouble. 1857 was the year. They were both free at this point, but they were also conductors on the Underground Railroad. And there had been some things that happened, particularly an escape called the Dover 8, which was like a Hollywood action movie. Escapees were trapped in the Dover jail. The escapees were from Dorchester County. They were trapped in the jail in Dover, and there was gunfire, and there was fire, and there were people jumping out of second-story windows, and they all made it out of the Dover jail and on to freedom. And this was much celebrated by abolitionists in the North and led to much horror among slave owners in the South who demanded that something be done. They arrested one alleged Underground Railroad conductor, Reverend Samuel Greene, and the rumor was that they were coming after Tubman's father next. She had no money. She was up in Canada at the time, but she starts to go down, even though she has no money and she needs money. She's got to get a carriage. They're too old. They're not going to be walking like so many of her other charges did. And she ends up in the office of the Anti-Slavery Society in New York City. And this is what happens according to a biography that was published in Tubman's lifetime. When she received an intimation in some mysterious or supernatural way that the old people were in trouble and needed her, she asked the Lord where she should go for money to enable her to go for them. She was directed to this office, and she gets in this office, and she went into the gentleman's office. "How do you do, Harriet? What do you want?" "I want some money, sir." "You do? How much do you want?" "I want $20, sir." $20? Who told you to come here for $20? "The Lord told me, sir." "He did? Well, I guess the Lord's mistaken this time." "No, sir, the Lord is never mistaken. I'm going to sit here till I get it." So she sat down and went to sleep. All the morning and all the afternoon she sat there still, sometimes sleeping, sometimes rousing up, often finding the office full of gentlemen, sometimes finding herself alone. Sometimes she would be roused up with the words, "Come, Harriet, you had better go. There's no money for you here." Many fugitives were passing through New York at this time, and those who came in supposed her to be one of them, tired out and rested. She does not know all that happened, for deep sleep fell upon her, probably one of those turns of somnolency to which she has always been subject. But without doubt her story was whispered from one to another, and as her name and exploits were well known to many persons, the sympathy of some of those visitors in the office was aroused, and at all events, she came to full consciousness at last to find herself the happy possessor of $60, the contributions of these strangers. She went on her way rejoicing to bring her old parents from the land of bondage. So naturally, I give that chapter in the book the title, God Works in Mysterious Ways. If you're coming from Tillon towards St. Michael's in Easton, you've all probably seen the sign that says, "This highway dedicated to Frederick Douglass." Those signs are all over the country. This highway dedicated to this guy, this highway dedicated to this gal, this highway dedicated to this unit of the Army, whatever it might be. God bless all those signs, God bless all those people. It's my contention that there is no sign like that anywhere that is more fitting than this one. I've talked about the lack of stability in Douglass's life, lack of his connection with family. He also had a rotating cast of owners. His original owner died. He was inherited by that owner's daughter, who then married a guy named Thomas Auld, who then shipped Douglass off to Baltimore for a few years to his brother and sister-in-law. That sister-in-law is the one who started to teach him the letters of the alphabet before her husband found out about it and put a stop to it. There is a family spat, and he is sent back from Baltimore to St. Michael's. And he hates being in St. Michael's because he's a city boy by this point, and he thinks he's stuck in a backwater on the Eastern Shore now and is kind of depressed to be there. What sends him sort of back up to the top of the roller coaster is a mission. And I think of it, considering he's 14-ish, 15-ish years old, I think of it as a mission not unlike some high school kid out trying to do something with the homeless or with someone else or something like that. Another guy hears that, a free black man hears that he can read and asks him to teach blacks in St. Michael's to read. And so they set up a school. And being the naive young teenagers that he was, he made the mistake of not keeping this a secret, but doing it kind of wide open and very publicly. And his first lesson was broken up by a bunch of white guys with sticks who beat some of the students. And it's not clear from the biography whether Dr. Douglass himself got beat, but it was a violent breakup of this school. Thomas Auld, at this point, owns a store in downtown St. Michael's, which was located somewhere right near where that Frederick Douglass sign is by the parking lot and the little visitor kiosk in the middle of St. Michael's. There's a sign to him. It was located somewhere around there, and the post office was in there too. Excuse me. He has customers, and those customers are none too happy about this new arrival in their town who's trying to teach their blacks how to read. They're waiting to see what he's going to do to this kid. And what he does is he sends him to a slave breaker named Stephen Covey. Stephen Covey, if you're, well, let's just get back on Route 33, where this highway is dedicated to Frederick Douglass. He has to walk all the way out to, it's most of the way to McDaniel. It's most of the way to Tillman, and there's a Methodist church on the left. And if the crops aren't too tall, you can see the Chesapeake Bay off in the distance to the right. The Covey farm was out in the water there because of sea level rise and subsidence has taken over that property. But that's where the Covey farm was. And he's renowned as a slave breaker. As a writer, I love Douglass's description of him. He says he had a wolfish face and a voice that emerged from the side of his mouth in a light growl like a dog when an attempt is made to take a bone from him. This is where the real worst of America comes calling in Frederick Douglass's life. Psychological torture, physical torture, regular whippings. The guy was an evil genius to read Douglass's account of his time on the Covey farm. And Covey does, in fact, succeed in breaking this young boy. He says, I was broken in body, soul, and spirit. Everything came to a head during August of that year when Douglass collapsed in the fields, presumably suffering from heat stroke. Covey didn't buy it for a second and was kicking him and whipping him when he was on the ground. And Douglass responded to this that evening when he kind of came to by getting back on Route 33 and walking all the way back into St. Michael's, where he begged his owner, Thomas Auld, to save him from this slave breaker. And Thomas Auld sent him right back, and he's got to get right back out. He's got to walk along Route 33. Back out to McDaniel, right back out to that slave breaker. He takes his time doing that. This is a little corollary to the God works in mysterious ways Tubman story, except without the Christian angle. He runs into a rare character on the way. A character's name is Sandy. He ends up spending the night with him rather than going directly back to the Covey farm. And Sandy is first generation, still from Africa. And Douglass kind of explains the situation of what's going on, and Sandy and his wife take him into their house, and at one point, Sandy goes out in the forest and digs up a root of some sort, and gives the root to this young boy, and tells him, I forget which one, I should know in case I ever try this trick, tells him to keep it in either his right or his left pocket, and everything will be okay. He walks the rest of the way on Route 33, gets back to the Covey farm, and in kind of an awful worst of America irony, it's Sunday, and Stephen Covey obeys the Sabbath, so he doesn't do anything to Douglass until Monday morning. And on Monday morning, he brings him into the barn and commenced to try and start whipping him. Douglass, with this, I always like to think of with this root in his pocket, later his recollection is, from whence that fighting spirit came, I know not. And he fought back. In his autobiographies, this fight is like something out of a John Wayne movie, and it lasts for 4 hours or something. It goes on all day long and fighting and fighting. I'm sure it wasn't like that. But the important thing was, it was a draw. And Covey never got a good lick on him, either with his fist or with his whip. And all the other slaves on the Covey farm, they knew that it was a draw. And what Covey did at the end of that fight was walk away and proclaim victory, although everybody who watched the fight knew that he didn't win. And what Covey did after that was nothing. he basically stopped bothering this young boy. Now, there's been some speculation that he really did believe that he won the fight and it was all over and he'd broken this kid and that was it. There's been some speculation that maybe Thomas Auld got in touch with him and told him to just forget the whole thing and lay off. At the end of the year, I should give you one more Douglass quote at the end of that story. "However long I might remain a slave in form, the day had passed forever when I could be a slave in fact." He is sent the next year, these are one-year terms these people are sent out on, to a place called the Freeland Farm. And that guy has a reputation as a pretty good slave owner. In fact, Douglass recalls him as the best master I ever had before I became my own master. That is where Douglass tries to make his first escape from. He's got, they have liberated an old log canoe from somewhere and hidden it somewhere. He's got 4 co-conspirators. And they are going to go on Easter Sunday morning, except that on Holy Saturday, someone betrayed them. I'm sad to say that that someone was that first generation African, Sandy, who gave him the root and who Douglass had brought into the plot. He's the one who betrayed them. And so the 4 younger guys are all arrested, a bunch of people on horseback, come into the Freeland Farm, and back out on Route 33, he's got to walk to St. Michael's. They sit somewhere in St. Michael's and get kind of interrogated for a while, and then they got to walk all the way to Easton. He remembers there being people out on the road in Easton, screaming things at him and yelling things at him and calling him yellow-skinned devil, I think, and other such phrases while he's walking all the way to Easton. He spends 4 long days in the Easton jail. He's convinced that Thomas Auld is going to sell him. In fact, so is everybody else in town, and slave dealers are coming in, measuring his biceps, measuring his thighs. He has some really horrifying descriptions of what this experience is like in the jail. The other 3 slaves, their masters come, take them back to whatever fate awaits them. Auld makes him sit longer than the others. After 4 days, Auld finally appears, gets back on Route 33, walks all the way back to St. Michael's. Auld is threatening to sell him to a friend in Georgia on this walk, and this is when Douglass starts to wonder, because he knows Auld's affairs pretty well at this point, and he doesn't think he has any friends in Georgia, so he's trying to figure out what's going on. And what Auld ends up doing is sending him to Baltimore, which is more like a reward to Douglass than it is like a punishment. The only hint he gets is from a fellow slave who tells Douglass this: "Master Thomas was very unhappy that whole week. The night before his going up to release me from the jail, he had walked the floor nearly all night, evincing great distress." Back up in Baltimore, Douglass was no longer broken. He and some friends that he met up there started a group called the Mental Improvement Society, where they did oratory practice, taught each other to read and to speak. He met his wife, Anna Murray, who was from Denton and who was a free woman, and he escapes from Baltimore using some dodgy paperwork that makes him look like a free black merchant headed to New York to get on a boat and go away, and somehow that paperwork manages to get him on a train ride to freedom, where he marries Anna, eventually adopts the name Frederick Douglass, and eventually does all of the things that he came to do. Two more things that I would like to do here. One is a chapter in Tubman Travels called The Price of Freedom. I mentioned earlier how incomplete kind of historic markers are. Reverend Samuel Greene, I mentioned, was the first guy to get arrested after the big 1857 uproar about the Underground Railroad. He was born near East Newmarket and grew up to become a minister. He and his wife had 2 kids, Sam Jr. and Sarah. They Sam Sr. ended up becoming free when his master died and gave him his freedom in his will. And then Sam Sr. bought his wife's freedom, but the ownership and slavery passed through the mother, and so the children remained enslaved despite the fact that the parents were free. They got sold to a guy in Cambridge. The house is right on High Street. It's still there. It wasn't a good situation there. There was whipping and all manner of cruelty inflicted by this guy, Dr. James Muse, upon his servants, was the way Sam Greene Jr. remembered it. Sam Greene ran in 1854. Sam Sr. had a wonderful turn of phrase to describe this. He said he prayed with his legs. We know nothing about that escape except that it was successful. Sarah, Sam Jr.'s sister, also in the Muse house, was married with 2 kids, was immediately sold to Missouri and never heard from again in punishment for Sam Jr. escaping. Sam Jr. wrote a letter to his father that basically said, hey, I made it to Canada, everything's okay up here, I got a job. He ended that letter by saying, tell Joe Bailey, come on, tell somebody else, come on, tell everybody, come more. When they arrested Sam Sr. for allegations of running an underground railroad station, they found that letter. And that was one of the things that they put him on trial for. The other was for having a copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was a bestseller then, but the authorities in Dorchester County decided was insurrectionist literature. They first tried him on the issue of having some train schedules and getting to Canada, and this letter from Sam Jr. And that's another thing that keeps coming up in my work on the book, is sometimes you're just like, wait, what? Because that first trial, a rigged court system, all white slave-owning jury, they found him not guilty. But then they turned around and they did another trial on this Uncle Tom's Cabin business, and they found him guilty on that. Most of the attention, I think, in the history books that goes to this incident is about Sam Greene Jr., who then was sentenced to 10 years in the penitentiary in Baltimore. He was eventually pardoned by a governor after serving 4 or 5 years on the condition that he leave Maryland and never return. When he left Maryland, he went through New York, got hooked up with abolitionist people up there, and started giving speeches to raise money to help him get the rest of the way to Canada. In New York, he met Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. She later wrote a newspaper column and had this little tidbit in there. There came a black man to our house a few days ago who had spent 5 years at hard labor in a Maryland penitentiary for the crime of having a copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin in his home. He had been sentenced to 10 years, but on his promise to leave the state, was pardoned out. So he left Maryland without any acquisition, except an infirmity of the limbs which he had caught from prison labor. All this was his portion of the cross, and he took it meekly, without comment, only asking that as they did not allow him to finish reading the book, would we give him a copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin. That we did. I mentioned the focus on that is on Sam Sr. The reason why I kind of switched the focus a little bit to Sam Jr. gets back to that idea of how hard it was to leave. These people who ran knew that their loved ones, like Sam's sister, could and probably would be punished for their departure. He may not have known in writing a letter that it would be part of what led to his father's arrest and imprisonment, but that's why the title of that chapter is The Price of Freedom. One more little thing. All right, enough time for one more little thing? Because I want to get back to Frederick Douglass and a sort of reconciliation moment at the end of his life. Harriet Tubman never came back to Maryland after the Civil War. Of course, she had taken all of her family away, and so there wasn't any immediate family there because she had succeeded to the degree she could in putting that Humpty Dumpty family back together again. Douglass came back a bunch of times, including, I mentioned the one in Easton in 1878. The year before, he came to St. Michael's on the steamship Matilda, landed at Navy Point, This is again the point in his life when he's thinking about running for the Senate, or there's rumors he's running for the Senate. He has reporters following him on the steamboat and through St. Michael's. The reason, he does give a speech here, another of these Tony Robbins-ish self-help speeches, but the reason why he really wants to come is because Thomas Auld, the guy who sent him to that slave breaker, is on his deathbed, and Douglass wants to see him before he dies. In his first autobiography, no, actually this was Letter to a Slave Master, published in all the newspapers up north. Douglass had said this early on in his career as an abolitionist: "I intend to make use of you as a weapon with which to assail the system of slavery, as a means of bringing this guilty nation with yourself to repentance." There is no doubt whatsoever that Douglass was on the right side of history, that he fought the good fight, that he did countless brave, helpful, and noble things for a noble cause. There's also a couple of questions about whether maybe he went too far a couple of times. One of those had to do with an accusation that he made about Thomas Auld mistreating his beloved grandmother and putting her out in the cold in her old age and kind of kicking her off the farm. His grandmother did not end up in some beautiful assisted living facility like we have today, but by the standards of the time, Auld had treated her okay. And you can see in Douglass's 3 different autobiographies that he does this very aggressive version of the story, and then a toned down version of the story, and then a toned down version of the story. And when he really wants to come to Thomas Auld and see him before he dies, is to say, "I'm sorry for doing that false accusation." So the Dodson House B&B on Cherry Street, that's where this meeting happens. That's where one of Thomas Auld's daughters is living. They, at the time, in a magnanimous gesture, it seems silly today, let him come in the front door. And he goes up and he sees Auld. They have a formal greeting. Captain Auld, Marshal Douglass, he's Marshal of Washington, D.C. At this time. And he does indeed apologize for stretching the truth about his grandmother in that accusation. This gets him in all kinds of trouble. The New York Times editorialized, "Mr. Douglass's role as a leader of his race is about played out." Southern newspapers run a cartoon of Douglass, the elderly Douglass, on his knees in front of his former master. Douglass, to his credit, doesn't pay much attention to this and dismisses it all as kind of media silliness, which I think we can relate to some today. He asks Auld, he focuses in his section about asking Auld how he felt when he, Frederick Douglass, escaped from slavery. And Auld says, "Frederick, I always knew you were too smart to be a slave, and had I been in your place, I should have done as you did." Douglass replies, "Captain Auld, I am glad to hear you say this. I did not run away from you, I ran away from slavery." When I got done reading, Douglass's autobiographies and a bunch of biographies and a bunch of other stuff, and just I got to the point where it's like, okay, it's time to stop reading and start writing. I remember that I kind of walked down, and my wife was in the living room, and I just was just shaking my head and saying, "Jesus, what a decent man." And that's really what I found. It was that moment of him feeling a need to go apologize to Thomas Auld. That left me feeling like that, and that's, these were really decent people in really indecent situations, and as the phrase that I used before, these were people at the very bottom of society who did some glorious things in inglorious times. Thank you very much for coming out tonight.
Take your own Underground Railroad journeys. There is a book, 32 of them in this book, and since we all have friends and family come to visit us because we live in a really beautiful part of the country, you can buy this book also by Jim Duffy. It's the Eastern Shore Road Trips, 27 one-day adventures on Delmarva. And for any other travel books, just come to your library. Bye-bye.